certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Leather gloves found near Jane Rimmer's body were sent to be tested for blood. It's the very first time this item has been mentioned in court. Hi everyone, welcome to week 11 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo joining you in the studio with forensic scientist Brendan Chapman, and on the phone from court, Tim Clarke. So Tim, these leather gloves came from out of the blue?
Yes, they did, Nat. This was in the context of items that were sent to Path West for testing over the years relating to all the incidents, and a list that was received by Aleks Bagdonavicius back in the day was shown in court today. And looking at that list, there was one, there was a couple of items that stood out, but this was the one that stood out the furthest, I have to say, because we hadn't really heard about it before. These were a pair of leather gloves that were apparently found in a waterway quite close to where Jane's body was discovered in 1996. There was a drainage ditch basically running alongside and then behind the area where Jane's body was discovered. And we think that those gloves might have been found in there. We don't know when, but it was certainly very soon after, because they were all contained in a batch of exhibits that were then sent to Path West straight away, which also included the knife, the Telstra issue knife that we heard so much about earlier in the trial. But these gloves were included, and obviously in a murder scene like this, when you find a pair of gloves, it would have been absolutely at the top of the list of priorities, I would have said, for the police to try and see whether there was anything on them, particularly blood, and that was what they were specifically sent to Path West to have a look for.
And did you find out any information about any results that came from the testing of the gloves?
No, we didn't as yet. This was the list that was sent with the exhibits for them to be received by Path West. But as to the results of that testing and whether anything came of it, we didn't hear today, and we're not sure we're going to, because, of course, this has only been raised now, and it certainly hasn't been raised in the context of Mr. Edwards or any connection between him and these gloves. But it is another one of these things that we didn't know that was important to the police at the time, but we're finding out more and more of every single one of these hundreds and thousands of leads that they followed over the journey. But you would imagine that at the time they would have thought that was very significant.
Brendan, let's say any pair of gloves were found or left in water for 55 days. What would be the chances of finding anything, be it blood or anything else, on those gloves?
It's hard to say, Nat, but you would potentially be able to identify DNA or cellular material from the wearer, given that they probably have a high load of DNA from wear. Blood, it's really difficult. Depends on the makeup of the glove as to whether blood would retain or soak in. Leather, perhaps it might soak into the glove, but really it's anyone's guess.
So water doesn't necessarily, if something's soaking in water for months, it doesn't necessarily wash away DNA?
No, not necessarily. It can, but in an exhibit shaped like a glove, there will be areas that are, I suppose, somewhat protected. They're going to get wet, but it's not to say that it's not like it's going through a tumble washing machine sort of cycle. And in fact, we've even done we've published articles on clothing that has gone through washing machines, for instance, and still retained cellular material after a number of cycles. So it is possible. It's just one of those things where a negative result doesn't mean it wasn't originally there, but a positive result is not necessarily impossible.
Tim, you'd have to speculate that, given we haven't heard about this from the prosecution, that I guess maybe nothing was found.
Well, indeed. Now, I'm sure if there was a significant find on it, one way or the other, we would have heard about it by now. So, yes, you would have to deduce, but even if this testing was done and the results were kept, there is and was absolutely no link to Mr. Edwards because it hasn't been raised in that context at all. But one of those things which I would imagine when the police found those way back in the day, they would have been really hoping that would have been a major clue and a major lead for them.
And quite likely ended up being a major disappointment, we expect. What other items was Mr. Bagdonavicius cross-examined about today?
Well, a few actually, Nat. One of the main ones was a branch that was found on top of Jane's body when she was found in situ. As we've discussed previously, when she was found, she was partially covered. Her body was partially covered by local vegetation that police believed had been taken from nearby and placed over her as some sort of crude cover to try and hide whatever had happened to her. And these branches, as we've heard, they all became part of the mass of forensic material that was collected at the time, both on top of Jane's body and underneath. And there were two items in particular that Mr. Bagdonavicius was questioned about today. They got the labels RH21 and 22. 21 and 22 were twigs, basically, just not palm fronds or anything like that. They were literally branches, sticks, twigs. And in particular, Mr. Bagdonavicius was questioned about these because in his opening remarks 11 sitting weeks ago now, Mr. Yovich highlighted that it was one of these RH21 that when it was tested later on was found to have been contaminated by the DNA of a victim of a completely unrelated case. And this is one of the 4 or 5 examples that Mr. Yovich is going to use as exemplar of what he says were sloppy practices at Path West, which could have led to Mr. Edwards' DNA being found on Kira's fingernails. So he was asked in quite specific detail how he had what his role was, and he said it was as a supervisor to the examination of these branches, this vegetation, who the examiners were, and they turned out to be female Path West scientists because there was a fear that if there was any contamination and if it was male, it might really get in the way of any investigation. And he was asked how long it took to do this, because there were a lot. We saw photos of these branches, and there were a lot of them. They were small, they were big, they were small. There was a lot to go through there forensically, and it said it would have taken him or them possibly up to a week just to test this one bag of branches, get the DNA swabs off them, and then send them off for testing. So that was of interest, and he was also asked about some other items later on in 2003 when he was tasked to compile this priority list of all the exhibits that had been collected over the years, and then he was grilled on that towards the end of the day.
So was there any clarity at all as to who this other victim's DNA belonged to, or any indication as to how it could have got there?
Not as yet, Matt, but I do think we will get to that. Whether we get to that through this witness, Mr. Bagdonavicius, or others, we're not sure. But Mr. Yovich was certainly edging towards that by asking all the relevant questions about how it was handled, what the procedures were, what the protection clothing was worn, whether Mr. Bagdonavicius himself had handled those branches, and he said he hadn't. He was quite adamant about that it was the female staff members, because of that contamination risk, that were tasked with it, and he was just overseeing it. But he did say that he was in the vicinity of those branches when they were gone through.
Brendan, I think in a previous podcast we talked about how many cross-contamination items would happen across the country in a guesstimate, and it was around sort of the 2% mark, one of the witnesses said. So in terms of contamination of these sorts of things, can you just talk to us again about the ways that could happen, whether it be primary contamination or secondary transfer?
Yeah, sure. There's a whole range of ways that foreign DNA, I suppose, can end up on an exhibit. They're not all nefarious. In some cases, it's incidental. I suppose if we talk about the lifespan of an exhibit, it starts at a crime scene, and so they can become contaminated with something at a scene. Now, that could be a police officer attending a scene. It could be an ambulance officer, for instance, going to attend to injuries. It could actually also be someone living in the house that has also come into contact with an item. So that's kind of where it all starts. Thereafter, you've got a whole range of other vectors, I suppose, or transmission methods where DNA can contaminate an exhibit. For instance, while we try and utilise disposable items as often as possible throughout the whole procedure from crime scene to a lab, sometimes you just can't do that. We have pieces of equipment, for instance, that we take into crime scenes that are, very expensive, and we have to, clean those and reuse them from one scene to another. So then you've got opportunity there for DNA to be transferred on equipment, in vehicles, on clothing, and that's before an exhibit even gets to the lab. And then when you're in the lab, you've got opportunities for other exhibits that have been analysed in the same area or in the same bench, and there might be a week or 2 weeks difference between those, or a couple of minutes. Utensils within a laboratory, and then further down the line, once we start to undergo PCR, this amplification process where we copy up DNA, we're then creating millions and millions of tiny molecules of DNA that, depending on your processes in the laboratory, can be very easily transmitted around. So the short answer is there's a huge number of ways that it can happen, but those primary vectors or those primary transfer opportunities are just me, for instance, into a sample, or cross-contamination where we mix a sample incorrectly into another sample. For instance, we have two tubes open at the same time, or errors like that. But we mitigate against those sort of things by having rules and procedures and policies that we work to, whereby no two samples are open at the same time, or an area where an exhibit is analysed must be cleaned afterwards. We also even try and, where possible, separate samples that we believe are going to have a lot of DNA or a lot of cells. So samples with things like blood, we know will have lots and lots of DNA, compared to something which has just been contacted, we know will have less. So we try and even separate those sorts of things. And then the final major separation we make is separating our people samples from our crime scene samples. So where an exhibit has been taken from a suspect or a witness, one of those buccal swabs or a mouth swab, we always try, and most laboratories will distinctly separate those into a separate lab from the exhibits where the crime scene stuff is analysed.
considering how many ways that contamination can happen, the fact that it is such a low percentage is extraordinary, really. I mean, it suggests that by and far practices are very, very tight.
Yeah, I've been in a number of forensic labs throughout the country, and Australian practices in DNA labs are top-notch.
Tim, I know the defence is honing in on, this contamination and that it potentially happened within the lab. And today, Mr. Yovich was asking this question again as, who had access? Who could get into this lab?
Yes, and he even went so far as to ask Mr. Bagdonavicius to draw a map of the layout of the lab himself, a little thumbnail sketch on a piece of A4 paper that was handed up to him, which it was to test Mr. Bagdonavicius's memory as much as anything, I think. But the layout of the lab was then described as the DNA part of the laboratory was on one side of the corridor, and the item examination area was on the other side of the corridor, and in theory never the twain should meet, because obviously, as Brenner's pointed out to us many times, the work in the DNA lab by its very nature meant that there was a lot of DNA flying around in there, although we're told it doesn't fly around, if you know what I mean. Whereas in the item examination unit, you've got physical exhibits and, stuff from the outside world, basically. So they tried to keep them separate. And you're right, Mr. Yovich at one point did ask Mr. Bagdonavicius, when all this was being explained, and about the security and who was let in and who was let out, and how and who was supposed to accompany who to what parts of the lab. He did ask again whether there was any outside tradespeople allowed into the lab to do any work, and this alluded to the line of questioning several weeks ago now, where it was hinted possibly that some work may have been done on the phones in that laboratory, and we all know that by now that Mr. Edwards was a Telstra worker of many years long standing. Mr. Bagdonavicius said it was really tight, so even if a light bulb needed changing, they had to go to security to get them to change it. The cleaners were the same cleaners that were used in the mortuary downstairs, so they were very well aware of all the needs for that particular setting. It wasn't just a hire a handyman type of cleaning arrangement. It was just, very specific tasks done by specific people in the hospital. But again, it gives a hint of where Mr. Yovich might be heading with this question again, that there might be just a suggestion of somehow Mr. Edwards or one of his colleagues possibly getting access to that lab at some point.
It's interesting whether he would be able to take that questioning any further, or if there's any, records of the comings and goings in a more detailed sense. Indeed,
it's hard to tell whether he's fishing there or whether he has some knowledge that he's trying to get out of witnesses as we go along. It'll be very interesting come the day, if he does have that knowledge, when he reveals it, or if he reveals it.
You mentioned earlier about the testing in 2003 of the nails, and I understand today the reason that retesting was ordered was because of something discovered in a taxi.
Yeah, this was also very interesting, something we hadn't heard before. As I mentioned earlier and in previous podcasts, Mr. Bagdonavicius in 2003 was asked by the police to draw up a priority list of all the exhibits that they had on the macro investigation involving Sarah and Jane and Kira, and to prioritise them, basically. The police wanted to know what they had, what testing had been done, and then together they were going to put their heads together and say, well, what do we think we can do? And top of that list, so Mr. Bagdonavicius said he made 10 of these lists, and priority 1 was all of Kira's fingernails, which we've discussed ad infinitum, GM 40 to 50, which included the swab. But at the end of that list, we found out today there were 2 other fingernail samples, EC 12 and 13, which had, at some stage, we don't know when, in some contexts, we don't know what, were found inside a taxi in Perth somewhere. And these nails had become exhibits, possible evidence, and what police wanted Pathwest to do was to retest all Kira's fingernails to see if there were any cross matches, any likely leads going from one way to the other. And so that is where the low copy number testing that Pathwest did, which we discussed previously, which they were unaccredited to do, but thought they may be able to do anyway to give the police some new leads. That was why that testing was ordered at that time, because they had these 2 fingernail samples from an outside source, and they wanted to see if there was anything they could match, particularly with Kira's nails.
Again, this leaves so many unanswered questions. Who did those nails belong to? Why were they there? Why were they being cross-referenced? And it could very well be another one of these questions where we're left hanging and not knowing where it's going to go.
Yeah, well, so on the list that Mr. Bagdonavicius had made back in August and then November 2003, the results from the testing of those mystery nails were actually on the list. For the first one, it said that it was a female, but it wasn't Sarah, Jane, or Kira. And the second one, it was a male, but they didn't have anyone to bring it back to. So they'd done the testing, they'd hit a brick wall to say, well, none of these nails are actually belong to any of the 3 victims, and that male nail, who knows who that belongs to. I don't think anyone knows, and will probably never will. But it would be interesting to know how they came about them and why they were so interested in them, so interested that they went to Pathwest and said, can you retest all Kira's nails again, which was not a small undertaking.
Very interesting. And Brendan, Tim's just mentioning the LCN testing there, which at the time the lab wasn't accredited to do, as he said. So why does a lab have to be accredited, or why should it have been accredited at the time?
It's a technique, or it's a process that we refer to as validation. And what it means is when we, in any laboratory actually, whether it's a pathology lab doing blood tests or a forensic DNA lab, what it means is that we've tested this technique and we know the limitations, and we are well aware of the scope for how it works. So we do it has to go through a whole bunch of testing to make sure that if we put the same thing in on different days, we get the same result. If we put in what are the limit of how much we can put in to get a result, and that's across any kind of clinical test as well. And by accredited, what that means is it means that the laboratory has undergone that process of validating it and knowing the limitations of the test. If a lab's not accredited to do something, it doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means that they haven't undertaken those checks and balances, which in a forensic environment means that we can't produce something to the validity or robustness that the court requires.
And can you maybe recap for us the difference between the low copy number testing as opposed to the normal testing that was being done?
Yeah, so low copy number testing in forensics, it basically refers to that process of PCR where we are amplifying up DNA, we're making copies of it. And if you remember a few weeks ago when I talked about that process, I kind of compared it to the photocopier, where you have a sheet of paper and you feed it into the photocopier, and every time you feed it in, you get 2 copies out the other end. And then you take those 2 copies and you put those into the feeder and you get 4 copies, and so on and so forth. Now, normal or routine testing, we do that process of cycling in and out of the photocopying machine around about 28 times. And we generate, you can imagine, a huge amount of DNA from a small amount of starting material. LCN analysis doesn't change anything other than the fact that after 28 cycles, we're pulling out that ream now and feeding it back in again and again and again, up to around about, say, 35 cycles of PCR. Now, so what? Everyone might ask. And the thing is, just like a photocopier, where you're putting in a piece of paper and you're photocopying a photocopy and you're photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy, the more times you do that, the harder it is to read the sheet of paper. And so our conventional testing, we know that after 28 cycles, we still have a clear view of what the picture is or what the text is on the page. Where the controversialness, I suppose, about LCN testing comes in is where we start to lose sight of some of those letters on the page. So, and that equates to how we can interpret the DNA as well. It's less predictable in how we observe it. We know using conventional testing with a large amount of starting material that if we have half of one person's cellular material and half of another person's, and we put it in to test it, our results show that we get about half of signal from person one, half of signal from person two. With LCN testing, some of those kind of rules start to get a little fuzzy. And so we can start to see over-representation of one person over another. So our end result might show that there's a huge amount of signal for a particular fragment of DNA, but that might not be, might not actually reflect what was there in the beginning. So it doesn't change the result. The result is still an answer that of what was there. It's just that it starts to get a little more, I suppose, speculative in how we can interpret it.
So does that require a level of training, the ability to be able to read the result? The result is there, it's whether you are able to analyse it and read it correctly.
The results are the same as a conventional test. So we get the same visual display. It's the understanding of what that means when you've used a technique that you're less familiar with and it hasn't gone through that validation process where we know the limitations. So laboratories that are specifically set up to do LCN testing and have validated it, to use that word again, have imposed a new bunch of rules around how they test them. So one of the kind of golden rules around doing LCN analysis is that all results must be replicated at least twice, if not more. So that means you have to put a sample in one end of the pipeline and get a result out the other end and get that exact same thing done a second time as well and get the same result. So these are just some of the nuances to doing LCN testing, which is why laboratories that are set up to do it are the ones that do it. You also have factors like, because you are copying up more of that underlying DNA, you really need to have probably a higher stringency of laboratory procedures, routine cleaning, and protective equipment on people working in that lab that you could be a little more lax with in doing conventional analysis. So, yeah, that's why LCN labs are LCN labs, and that's why places like the FSS did it, because they've done it, they know the limitations, and they're set up to do that.
Yeah, honestly, you can see why this is called forensic science, can't you? It is just so minute and so detailed. Tim, Mr. Yovich was being a bit forensic when he was asking Mr. Bagdonavicius about the documents and, you know, exactly how he sort of signed it or had a little signature to show that it was his. What was the purpose of all of that?
Well, it was, very detailed, very exacting, and once again, it was trying to get to the heart of what Mr. Bagdonavicius's practices were and what he said they were, and whether the two did match up. He was asked today about labelling, whether a lost label on a bottle or a swab could be overcome At one point, Mr. Bagdonavicius says, yes, it could be overcome by a plastic band and just put two swabs together using the one label. There was items regarding the way he wrote things, the way he noted things, the way he recorded things, or if he didn't record things. And at one point, he was taken to the register of the exhibits, particularly relating to Kira, and he had placed asterisks next to the ones that he either wanted to be sent to DNA or for DNA testing, or whether they had in fact been sent to DNA testing. And it was at this point that Mr. Yovich honed in on an asterisk that was placed in the wrong column, where in fact it was placed on an intimate swab, where Mr. Bagdonavicius had said or put the asterisk next to a T-shirt or Kira's shirt. And he was taken through that for quite a while and asked some quite pointed questions about that could be that 2 centimetre gap between where the asterisk should have been and where it was could have been a major vital mistake, because it could lead to issues of, well, this T-shirt has been sent to DNA testing, but it's not there anymore. Where is it? And a lot of hours could have been spent possibly trying to fix that very apparently simple and minor mistake. So that was the level of detail we were going to. He was also asked about, when he was putting together this matrix, some quite pointed questions about, did you rush it? Were you under pressure to rush it? And he quite candidly admitted, yes, I probably did rush it a little bit, because we heard last week that in the first draft there were quite a few errors in it. Mr. Bagdonavicius hasn't finished his cross-examination yet. He'll be back in the morning, and I would not be surprised if we go to similar areas again before he's finally released from his part in this trial.
Yeah, I mean, well, given the case that he was working on, you would expect that you would be feeling a degree of pressure to come up with, answers as fast as you could, while still obviously taking the greatest of care. Brendan, we have a question for you from Roger, who says, from what they have, is it possible to determine what type of cell the DNA originated from on each exhibit? I.e., can you tell, besides sperm cells, whether a sample is male or female, and how?
So, yes, we can tell the difference between whether DNA is male or female, and we do that by looking at areas on the chromosomes specific for males and females. So females have 2 X chromosomes, males have an X and a Y, and we look at markers on those chromosomes in order to identify male and female. So that's an easy one. The other part of the question about identifying what cell type DNA originates from is kind of, we're really on the cusp of that now in research. We're starting to see experimental tests where we can identify whether, for instance, cells derived from blood, for instance, are derived from circulatory blood or compared to menstrual blood, for instance. So the answer to the question is no, but we're almost there.
Yeah. Brendan, Alison Van keeps saying that the level of detail is just so extraordinary in terms of the forensics that are being discussed, and that anyone who is a forensic student should be getting into that courtroom as quick as they can. Have you got students going in there or lining up to go in and listen in?
I have had a couple that have popped in, and I'm trying to take some in this week before the semester gets really busy next week and university comes back. So I'm hoping to make an appearance this week, and with a bunch of eager master's students actually. So we'll keep an eye out for you, Tim.
Oh, I'll keep an eye out for you as well, but make sure they all have their phones turned off, please.
Yeah. You don't want them getting in trouble. Well, thank you both for your expertise today. Email us your questions to claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au. And we'll be back tomorrow with Tim and Alison Fan for day 47 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.